Maria's most recent book, Today Will Be Different, was featured on the cover of the New York Times Book Review, instantly became a bestseller, and is being made into a limited TV series. Please welcome Maria Semple.
Thank you, Nancy. I'd like to talk about learning and the Hugo House. But let me start by mentioning how horrible the internet is. Because I'm an old lady and that's what we do. Some recent assaults on my dignity at the hands of the internet. My 88-year-old mother's discovery of Bitmojis. She used to write lovely emails, but now everything she has to say can apparently be conveyed by a much younger version of herself wearing a Rams jersey, barbecue mitt, and surrounded by some kind of flame. No words necessary for her. Another thing I'm not crazy about, the rash of one-star reviews of my last novel with the helpful critique, I wish there was an option for 0 stars. But those things are cool, you adjust, you move on. Here's something I can't shrug off, though. A friend mentioned that kids nowadays, on their computers, for a home page, they have Google. My friend blithely explained, pretty soon they won't need teachers. Hey, she seemed to say with a wave of her hand, step aside, it's progress, what can you do? I love to learn, I always have. In high school, you could always find me in the front row, one of those annoying students who raised her hand so often that the teacher copped a perpetual glazed expression, pretending not to see me. In college, I double majored in English and history. I took so many classes I could have graduated in 3 years, but stayed for 4 because more learning for me. It wasn't just the knowledge I found such a turn on. It was my teachers. When I walked into the first day of class, the teachers were these formidable entities who had power over me. I slowly became to appreciate they were quirky people with curious passions. They didn't just teach the facts, but their highly subjective takes on the facts, informed by their teachers, their childhoods, the enormous time they spent reading and pondering. And here they were, passing down the best of it to me. Back then, I found it exciting, strange, and somewhat pathetic. Now I find it deeply moving. 10 years ago, when I moved to Seattle, I wanted to go back to school. I looked into getting a master's in English at the University of Washington. But in order to graduate, I'd have to become proficient in a second language. And who has time for that bullshit? So one day, I was talking to Paul Constant, who's probably here somewhere. I told him I was looking to learn. I didn't care what. I just wanted the experience of knowledge being transmitted person to person. Who, I asked him, was the best teacher around? He pointed me towards the poet Ed Skoog, who happened to also teach at the Hugo House. I contacted Ed out of the blue, and we began a years-long poetry class, one-on-one. We'd meet Thursday mornings at the Blue Star Cafe in Wallingford. He'd assign me a poem to memorize, I'd recite it, and we'd let the freewheeling discussion gallop wherever it wanted. Our first lesson, I was so moved at Ed's ardor for Robert Frost that I started to cry. Seeing me cry, he began crying. Seeing us both crying, the waiter asked, "Did you two just get engaged?" From then on, each week Ed and I arrived, the wait staff seemed to draw straws over who didn't get to serve our table. So you can see why I adore the Hugo House. It's loaded with the best teachers. I've probably taken a dozen classes here myself, from Sam Lipsyte, Claire Dieterer, Steve Almond, Sheila Hetty, Ben Lerner, Meg Wolitzer, Josh Ferris, Jess Walter, to name a few. I rarely miss a WordWorks. I don't even bother to look at who's lecturing or about what. I just show up, pen in hand, to lap up their personalities and hard-won expertise. And to be the first to raise my hand from the front row, because yes, I'm still that annoying. 8 years ago, I was asked to read at Hugo House for a series they used to have called Cheap Beer and Prose. We all remember that. I'm not the kind of writer who has a bunch of top-notch rhyme lying around. No buried treasures on hand. But I was 20 pages into a new novel I wasn't quite sure of, so I said yes. When it was my turn, I stood up in the jam-packed cafe at the old house and read from the opening pages. It was the voice of an unhappy woman. This is very moving to me, sorry. It was the voice of an unhappy woman who just moved to Seattle and hated the people, architecture, and street grid. It had come deep from within. Reading it aloud was terrifying, like jumping off a cliff. And I'll tell you something, the people in the audience that night, who'd each paid $1 to get in, every stripe of person, they reacted with disappointment and dismay. They actually seemed to despise me. I left the stage trembling and nauseous. The whole experience was traumatic, but something deep inside was self-destructive enough to think I was onto something. So I doubled down, and within months I'd finished a draft of my novel, Where'd You Go, Bernadette? So thank you, Hugo House, and the humorless crowds you draw. Thank you to the teachers, thank you to my students, thank you to Tree Swenson, Linda Brenneman, Andrea Lewis, and especially my pal Francis McHugh. Thank you for welcoming all of us and for making Hugo House a home.